She had worn silk for 40 years. She knew ballrooms, titles, and the particular silence that falls when a duchess enters a room. But on this morning, she wore an apron. She carried a laundry basket, and she walked through her own son's servant's entrance as though she had never owned anything at all. No one recognized her. No one stopped her. No one looked twice at the quiet woman with the wicker basket moving through the corridors of Whitmore House. That was exactly what she needed. Because somewhere above her, in a gilded drawing room that still smelled of her late husband's memory, a woman was speaking in a low, comfortable voice. The voice of someone who believes she is completely alone, and what she was saying was not meant for anyone to hear. But Margaret Ashford heard every word, and by the time she walked back out through that servant's door, she had heard enough to end everything. This is the story of what a mother did, not with power, not with fury, not with the weight of a title, but with a laundry basket, a pair of listening ears, and the particular patience of a woman who knew exactly how long to wait before she acted. She had worn silk for 40 years. She knew what it felt like to walk into a room and have every head turn, every voice lower, every back straighten. But on that particular morning, Margaret, the Dowager Duchess of Ashford, wore a plain linen dress, a cotton apron, and carried a wicker basket of freshly pressed linens as if she had done it her entire life. No powder, no jewels, no title announced at the door. Just a woman who looked like she belonged in the servants' corridor. And that was precisely the point. She had not planned to come in disguise. The idea had arrived 3 nights earlier, when a letter reached her at the country estate. Not addressed to her, but left open on the writing desk by a careless footman. A single line had caught her eye, written in a hand she did not recognize. He still doesn't know, and as long as you keep him distracted, he never will. She had read it twice, folded it quietly, and said nothing to anyone. But she had not slept since. The carriage dropped her 2 streets away from Whitmore House, her son's London residence. She walked the rest of the distance alone, basket in hand, heart steady. She was not a woman who acted on emotion. She was a woman who acted on certainty, and she intended to find it before the week was out. What she did not know yet was that certainty would find her far sooner than expected. The servants' entrance to Whitmore House was tucked behind a hedge of trimmed boxwood, unremarkable and easy to miss if you did not know where to look. Margaret knew exactly where to look. She had designed the garden herself 30 years ago, when the house had still belonged to her late husband. She pressed the iron latch and stepped inside without knocking, the way any laundress returning with a delivery would. No one stopped her. No one even looked up. The kitchen was busy with the noise of a household preparing for a midday meal. 2 maids moved between the stove and the pantry. A boy polished silver at the far end of the table. An older woman, the housekeeper, Margaret assumed, stood with her back turned, reviewing a list of some kind. None of them recognized the woman in the apron. Why would they? The Dowager Duchess of Ashford had not visited this house in over a year, and when she had, she arrived at the front door in a lacquered carriage with the family crest on the door. She set the basket down near the linen cupboard, folded her hands over her apron, and allowed herself one slow breath. The house smelled of beeswax and cut flowers, expensive ones, she noted, peonies, most likely, out of season and difficult to source. Someone was spending freely here, and that someone was not her son's housekeeper. She picked up the basket again and moved quietly toward the hallway. Somewhere above her, she could already hear a woman's voice, light and deliberate, carrying through the floorboards like smoke. The corridor that led from the kitchen to the main staircase was long and poorly lit in the middle of the day, the curtains on the east-facing windows drawn against the summer heat. Margaret walked it slowly, her steps practiced and soft. She had spent a lifetime learning how to move through grand houses without disturbing them. As a duchess, you learned quickly that stillness was a form of power. Now she used that same stillness to become invisible. The house itself felt different from how she remembered it. Not in its bones, the plasterwork was the same, the portraits of Ashford ancestors still lined the upper hall, the smell of old wood and polish was unchanged. But there was something else layered over all of it now. A new presence, small signs of a life being lived here that had nothing to do with her son's reserved and solitary habits. A pair of embroidered gloves left on the console table, a half-empty perfume bottle near the windowsill, a vase of those extravagant peonies placed not where a housekeeper would set them, but where a woman who considered herself mistress of the space would. Margaret paused at the foot of the staircase and looked up. From the drawing-room at the top of the landing came the sound of that voice again, clearer now, and unmistakably comfortable. Whoever was speaking up there felt entirely at home. And the silence of the rest of the house, the careful, trained silence of servants who had learned not to react, told Margaret everything she needed to know about how long this arrangement had been in place. She began to climb the stairs. The drawing-room door was open by 3 inches, not enough to see clearly, but more than enough to hear. Margaret stopped just outside it, back against the wall, basket resting against her hip. Through the gap she could see a slice of the room, the corner of the fireplace, a edge of the gold-framed mirror above it, and the hem of a dress the color of deep burgundy, moving as its wearer paced slowly back and forth. The fabric was extraordinary, Italian silk by the look of it, the kind of dress that announced its own price with every step. The woman inside was speaking to someone Margaret could not see, perhaps a maid, perhaps a companion. Her voice was confident in the way of someone who had grown accustomed to not being interrupted. She spoke about the upcoming season, about a dinner she intended to host at Whitmore House in September, about changes she planned to make to the East Wing. She spoke about these things not as suggestions, not as dreams, but as decisions already made. The certainty in her voice was almost architectural, solid, load-bearing, constructed over time. Margaret remained perfectly still. She had met women like this before, women who understood that proximity to power was its own form of currency, and who spent that currency with extraordinary precision. What struck her was not the ambition. Ambition she understood and could even respect. What struck her was the ease. This woman moved through her son's house as though she had already inherited it. And somewhere beneath the gilded ceiling of that drawing-room, something was being arranged that her son almost certainly did not fully understand. The conversation shifted without warning. The pacing stopped. The woman's voice dropped half a register, not to a whisper, but to the particular tone people use when they believe no one important is listening. Margaret recognized that tone. She had used it herself once, a very long time ago, before she understood that walls in old houses had a way of remembering everything spoken inside them. "He'll sign it before autumn," the woman said. "He trusts me completely. That's the simplest part." A pause. Then, "The title stays with the house. If the marriage goes through in November, the entail transfers automatically. His mother will have no legal standing to contest it, not if he signs the settlement first." Another pause, longer this time, filled with the sound of silk moving across the floor. "She doesn't even know I exist. He's kept us very separate. That was his idea, but it suits me perfectly." Margaret did not move. She did not breathe differently. She did not allow a single muscle in her face to change. The basket in her hands was suddenly very heavy, though it weighed no more than it had 2 minutes ago. She had come to this house looking for the shape of a suspicion. She had found instead a blueprint. Her son was not simply being deceived by a woman who loved him carelessly. He was being guided with extraordinary patience and deliberate architecture toward a decision that would dismantle everything his family had built across 4 generations. And he did not know. Not yet. And that was only what she heard in the first 10 minutes. She hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't revealed herself. She was still just a woman, in an apron, holding a basket in a corridor, completely invisible to everyone inside that room. But what she had already heard was enough to change the course of an entire family's future. The question was, what would she do with it? Because Margaret Ashford had not survived 40 years in one of England's most powerful households by acting too quickly. She knew something that most people never learn, that the moment you reveal what you know, you lose the only advantage that truly matters. She still had more to find out, and she had no intention of showing her hand before every card was on the table. Stay with this story, because what she discovered in the next 3 days was far worse than anything she had heard through that door. There was one more sentence. Margaret almost missed it, because her mind was still processing the weight of what she had already heard. But the woman in the burgundy dress was not finished. She laughed, a small, private laugh, the kind shared between two people who believed themselves entirely alone. And then she said it, casually, the way someone mentions the weather. The boy complicates things slightly, but I've already spoken to the solicitor. By the time anyone thinks to ask questions, the paperwork will have been filed for months. The boy. Margaret's hand tightened on the wicker handle of the basket. She had one grandson. His name was Edward. He was 6 years old, and he lived with his maternal grandmother in the countryside following the death of his mother, her son's first wife, 2 years prior. The boy was the rightful heir to the Ashford title. Any marriage settlement that transferred the entail away from the direct line would effectively erase him, not from the family, not from memory, but from everything that the family name was legally obligated to protect. She had arrived at Whitmore House that morning prepared to find evidence of manipulation. She had not been prepared to find a plan that reached past her son, past the present, and extended its hand directly toward a 6-year-old child who was too young to understand what was being quietly taken from him. That was the moment something shifted in Margaret's chest, not into rage, though rage would have been entirely justified, into something colder, more precise, more dangerous. The door opened fully a moment later, not because Margaret pushed it, but because the maid inside the drawing-room moved to leave and found an obstacle in the corridor, a woman in an apron holding a linen basket standing very quietly against the wall. The maid startled. Margaret smiled pleasantly and gestured toward the linen cupboard down the hall as though she had simply been waiting for the right moment to pass. The maid recovered quickly and moved on without a word. But the door was now open, and Margaret had her first clear view of the woman inside. She was younger than the voice had suggested, perhaps 28, perhaps 30, dark-haired, pale-skinned, and genuinely beautiful in the way that required very little effort and knew it. She stood near the window with one hand resting on the frame, looking out at the street below, and there was something in her posture that Margaret recognized immediately. It was the posture of a woman rehearsing, running through lines, preparing for a performance that had not yet begun. She turned when she sensed she was being observed, and for one brief moment the two women looked at each other across the width of the drawing-room. The younger woman's expression moved through mild irritation, a servant hovering, and then settled into polite dismissal. She did not recognize Margaret. Of course she didn't. Margaret was wearing an apron and holding a basket, and people rarely looked past either. She offered a small nod toward the woman and moved on down the corridor, unhurried, unremarkable, completely invisible. It was the most useful she had felt in years. Margaret spent the rest of that morning moving carefully through the accessible parts of the house, doing what any laundress would do, replacing linens, checking the cupboards, drawing no attention. But her mind was working in the disciplined, methodical way it always had when the stakes were high enough to demand it. She was building a picture, detail by detail, the way you assemble evidence rather than assumption. What she found confirmed what she had heard. In the small writing room adjacent to the master's study, a room her son rarely used, there were papers. Not hidden precisely, but placed with the casualness of someone who did not expect them to be examined. Correspondence with a firm of solicitors she did not recognize. A draft of what appeared to be a marriage settlement, unsigned, with several clauses she recognized immediately as unusual. A letter referencing a property in the north that had been in the Ashford family since the reign of George II, described in the document not as an inheritance, but as a transferable asset, and a name repeated across multiple pages that did not belong to her son. The name was a man's. A business partner, perhaps, or a creditor. She could not determine which from what was available. But his presence in those documents, woven through the financial arrangements that surrounded her son's proposed marriage, suggested that this was not simply a woman in love with a duke. This was a transaction. Her son was the asset. And the woman in the burgundy dress was the broker. She left Whitmore House at noon, the same way she had entered, through the servants' door, past the boxwood hedge, and out onto the quiet side street where her carriage was waiting 2 blocks away. She climbed in without a word, set the empty basket on the seat beside her, and looked out the window as London moved past the glass. She did not speak for the entire journey home. Her lady's maid, who had been with her for 22 years and had learned to read silence the way other people read print, waited until they were inside before asking a single quiet question. Margaret answered it with 4 words. Not yet, but soon. The maid asked nothing further. She had heard that particular combination of words before, and she knew what it meant. It meant that the Dowager Duchess of Ashford had decided on a course of action. It meant that the action would be thorough, unhurried, and irrevocable. And it meant that whoever stood on the wrong side of it would not see it coming until it had already arrived. Margaret did not go to her son immediately because she understood something that urgency often destroys, the difference between stopping something and ending it. She could walk into Whitmore House that afternoon, announce who she was, confront the woman directly, and perhaps succeed in frightening her away. But fear was a temporary condition. People recovered from fear. What she needed was not a confrontation. What she needed was a case, the kind that could not be argued with, appealed, or reframed. And for that, she needed a few more days. She returned to Whitmore House 3 days later. Same apron, same basket, different linens. This time she arranged to cross paths with the woman directly, not by accident, but by design. She timed her arrival to coincide with the hour she had observed on her first visit, that the woman took her morning tea in the small sitting room off the main hall. Margaret arrived with a delivery of pressed tablecloths, knocked softly on the open door, and was waved inside by a hand that barely looked up from a letter being read near the window. She set the linens down and made no move to leave. Instead, she folded her hands and asked, in the mild, unhurried voice of a woman with nothing particular to prove, whether the household required anything additional for the following week. It was the kind of question servants asked, and the kind that usually produced a distracted dismissal. Instead, the woman looked up. Perhaps she was bored. Perhaps she was lonely in the particular way that people are when they live in houses that don't fully belong to them yet. Whatever the reason, she answered. And then she asked a question in return. They spoke for 11 minutes. Margaret counted. The woman was clever. She gave that to her without hesitation. Charming, in a way that was clearly practiced, but no less effective for it. She spoke about the house with proprietorial warmth. She mentioned the Duke, my James, she called him, which Margaret noted, with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed affection until it sounded entirely natural. And in those 11 minutes she revealed 3 things she almost certainly did not intend to reveal. The name of her solicitor, the date she expected the Duke to return from his northern estates, and the fact that she was, in her own words, very close to securing everything. She said it with a smile. Margaret smiled back. 11 minutes. That was all it took. 11 minutes of ordinary conversation between a duchess in disguise and a woman who had no idea who she was speaking to, and the plan that had been carefully hidden for months had begun to come apart at the seams. She hadn't asked a single dangerous question. She hadn't pressed or challenged or revealed a single detail of what she already knew. She had simply listened and smiled and let the silence do what silence always does to people who are hiding something. It made her talk. But here is what Margaret had not yet told anyone. Not her lady's maid, not her solicitor, not her son. There was one more piece, something she had seen on her very first visit, tucked inside a room the woman clearly believed no one ever entered. Something that, once confirmed, would make everything else irrelevant, because the conversation was damaging. The documents were damaging. But the secret that connected all of it, that was the thing that would make it impossible to deny, impossible to escape, and impossible to forgive. Margaret returned to her own house that evening and sat for a long time at the writing desk in her private study, a single candle burning beside her. She did not write anything. She simply thought carefully, without interruption, the way she had learned to think during the long years of managing an estate, raising a son alone, and navigating a society that confused elegance with weakness. She had made difficult decisions before. She knew what they felt like from the inside. They felt exactly like this. What her son could not see was not the woman's beauty, nor her intelligence, nor even her ambition. Those were visible enough to anyone paying attention. What he could not see was the architecture beneath it all, the patience with which it had been constructed, the number of people involved, the timeline that had been quietly running parallel to his own life without his knowledge. A man in love, even a careful man, sees what is in front of him. He does not naturally look for the load-bearing walls behind the wallpaper. That was not a flaw in her son. It was simply the particular blindness that comes with being the person a plan is designed around. She had watched him grow from a serious, watchful boy into a serious, watchful man. She knew his strengths, his loyalty, his sense of duty, his deep and private capacity for feeling. She also knew his vulnerabilities. He had grieved his first wife in near total silence, carrying it the way he carried everything difficult, inward, contained, without complaint. That kind of grief left openings, and the woman in the burgundy dress had found every single one of them. Over the following 4 days, Margaret made 2 more visits to Whitmore House. On the second visit she came in the early afternoon, when the drawing-room was empty, and the woman was reportedly out paying calls. She used the time carefully. She spoke at length with the under-butler, a young man named Collins who had been with the household since her son took possession of the house, and who still, she suspected, held a quiet loyalty to the family rather than to its current occupant. She did not ask him direct questions. She simply talked and listened and let him fill the silences. Collins told her, without realizing the full significance of what he was sharing, that the solicitor had visited 3 times in the past month, that certain documents had been sent to the northern estates for the Duke's review, that the woman had dismissed 2 members of staff in the past 6 weeks, both of them long-serving, both of them replaced with people of her own choosing, that the housekeeper, the same woman Margaret had seen on her first morning, had given notice the previous Friday and would be gone by the end of the month. The household, Collins said, with the careful understatement of a man choosing his words, had changed considerably. On her 3rd visit, Margaret requested access to the linen cupboard on the upper floor, a reasonable enough errand for a laundress. The cupboard was adjacent to the small writing room where she had found the documents on her first visit. The documents were gone. In their place was a locked rosewood box, the kind used for correspondence. She did not touch it. She noted its dimensions, its position on the shelf, and the particular style of the lock, a detail that would matter later when she sat down with her own solicitor and described, with complete precision, everything she had seen. It was Margaret's own solicitor, a meticulous man named Harcourt, who had served the Ashford family for 30 years, who uncovered the rest of it. She gave him the name she had found in the documents, the name of the firm, and the date of the draft settlement she had seen. She gave him 4 days. He came back in 3, and the expression on his face when he sat down across from her desk told her, before he spoke a single word, that it was worse than she had anticipated. The woman had a history that predated her involvement with the Duke of Ashford by nearly a decade. She had been previously connected, through a marriage that had lasted 14 months and ended in circumstances that were legally resolved but socially unspoken, to a merchant family in the north whose financial collapse had left a trail of disputed claims and unanswered letters. The man whose name appeared repeatedly in the settlement documents was her former brother-in-law. The arrangement they had constructed together was not new. It had been used before, in a smaller form, on a widowed baronet in Lincolnshire who had signed papers he did not fully understand, and spent 2 years in legal proceedings attempting to recover what he had lost. The child, Margaret's grandson Edward, appeared nowhere in their previous scheme because the baronet had no heir. With the Ashford dukedom, the stakes were categorically different. The entail, the estates, the title itself, all of it represented a scale of acquisition that required a longer timeline, a more careful approach, and a target who was grieving, isolated, and genuinely susceptible to the particular warmth that the woman in the burgundy dress deployed with such practiced precision. Her son was not the first. He had simply been chosen because he was, by far, the most valuable. She did not act in anger. She had never done anything important in anger. It was a principle she had held since girlhood, taught by a mother who said that a woman who acts in rage gives her opponent the narrative. Margaret acted on a Tuesday evening in the last week of August, when the summer light lasted long enough to make London feel briefly generous. She dressed carefully, in deep blue silk, her best pearls, and the small diamond brooch that had belonged to her mother-in-law. She arrived at Whitmore House at 7 o'clock in a carriage bearing the Ashford crest. She did not use the servants' entrance. The footman who opened the door recognized her immediately and went visibly pale. She smiled at him with genuine kindness. He was not at fault for anything, and asked to be shown to the drawing-room. She was told, with some anxiety, that the Duke was not at home. She said she was aware of that. She had, in fact, chosen this evening precisely because she knew her son was attending a dinner at his club, a standing engagement he kept on the last Tuesday of every month without exception. She was not here to see her son. Not yet. The woman in the burgundy dress was in the drawing-room when Margaret entered. She was seated near the fire with a book, and she looked up with the expression of someone expecting a servant, and finding instead something that required immediate recalibration. Margaret crossed the room without hurrying, sat down in the chair directly across from her, set her gloves on the arm of the chair with the quiet deliberateness of someone settling in for a conversation that would take as long as it needed to take, and said, in a voice she kept very warm and very even, "I believe we have already met, in a manner of speaking, though I was not properly introduced. My name is Margaret Ashford. I am the Duke's mother, and I think it is time we spoke honestly with each other." Margaret spent 40 minutes in that drawing-room. She did not raise her voice once. She did not make threats in the way that people who rely on threats usually make them, loudly, with visible emotion, with ultimatums designed to frighten. She spoke the way Harcourt had taught her to think about legal matters, with specificity, with sequence, with the particular calm of someone who has already won, and is simply allowing the other person time to understand it. When she rose to leave, she set a single envelope on the table beside the fire. She did not explain its contents. She simply said, "Read it before you make any further decisions. I would encourage you to do so tonight." She was home by 9 o'clock. She ate a light supper, read for an hour, and slept without difficulty. The deep, untroubled sleep of someone who has done what needed to be done and done it correctly. In the morning, her lady's maid brought tea and a note. The note was from Collins, the under-butler at Whitmore House, written in the careful hand of a man unused to corresponding with duchesses, but determined to be useful. It said only that the lady had called for her carriage at 10:30 the previous evening, and had not returned by the time he wrote. Her rooms, he added, had been left in considerable disorder. The envelope Margaret had left behind contained 3 things. The first was a copy of the draft settlement, annotated in Harcourt's precise hand, with the specific clauses that violated the terms of the Ashford entail. The second was a summary of the woman's previous legal history, including the name of the baronet in Lincolnshire and the outcome of his case. The third was a letter, 1 page, handwritten by Margaret herself, addressed not to the woman, but to her former brother-in-law, informing him that the Ashford family's solicitors were now fully aware of the arrangement and had already been in communication with the relevant authorities. It was not a threat. It was a notification. The difference, Margaret had always found, was everything. The letter had been delivered. The carriage had been called. The woman was gone before midnight. It should have been over. But there are people who, when cornered, go quiet. And there are people who, when cornered, make one final catastrophic decision. Who decide that if they cannot have what they planned for, they will at least ensure that everyone knows the version of the story that favors them. She had spent months constructing a careful, invisible approach. And now, with nothing left to lose, she abandoned every lesson that careful approach had taught her. She chose a public room, a full dinner table, an audience of exactly the kind of people whose opinions shaped reputations for decades. And she walked straight toward the Duke of Ashford with a speech she had clearly rehearsed. What she had not accounted for, what she had never once accounted for from the very beginning, was the woman already seated 4 feet away. The last confrontation was about to begin, and this time there would be no corridor to hide in, no door to stand behind, and absolutely no way to pretend she hadn't heard. Her son arrived at her house the following morning before breakfast. She heard the carriage before she saw him. The speed of it, the abruptness with which it stopped, and she was already in the front sitting-room, dressed and composed, when he came through the door. He was still wearing his coat. He had not stopped to remove it. He held the envelope in one hand, and his face had the particular expression of a man who has not slept and has been thinking so hard and so continuously that the thoughts had begun to wear grooves. He did not speak immediately. He sat down across from her, set the envelope on the table between them, and looked at her for a long moment with an expression she recognized. She had seen it on his face at 7 years old, when he had discovered that something he believed to be true was not, and the world had briefly required rearranging. She waited. She had always known how to wait for him. He was a man who needed to arrive at his own words before he could use them properly, and she had learned over decades of loving him that the worst thing she could do was hand him language before he was ready for it. When he finally spoke, he did not ask how she had found out, or why she had not come to him sooner, or what he was supposed to do now. He asked one question, and it was the right one. Edward. Not a full sentence. Just his son's name, spoken quietly, as both a question and an answer. Margaret leaned forward and covered his hand with hers. "Edward is perfectly safe," she said. "He was always going to be safe. I made certain of it." She watched something in her son's face, something that had been rigid and airless for 2 years, finally, at considerable cost, begin to release. The woman did not disappear quietly. Margaret had considered this possibility and had not found it troubling. People who had invested months in a careful plan did not simply absorb the collapse of it and withdraw with dignity and tact. There was one final attempt, a public one, which in retrospect was the worst strategic choice available, but which anger and desperation rarely allow people to avoid. It happened at Lady Forsyth's autumn dinner 3 weeks after Margaret's visit to Whitmore House. The woman arrived, uninvited, which was itself a statement, in the same burgundy dress, with the composed expression of someone who had rehearsed her entrance and intended to use it. The room, as rooms do when something unprecedented occurs, went very still. She walked directly toward the Duke of Ashford, who was standing near the window in conversation with two other gentlemen, and she addressed him in a voice pitched carefully to carry just far enough to be overheard by the nearest tables. What she said was designed to reframe everything, to present herself as a wronged woman, to suggest that the Duke had made promises he was now dishonorably withdrawing, to place the blame for the dissolution of their arrangement on his inconstancy rather than her own conduct. It was well constructed. It might even have worked in a different room, with a different audience, against a different family. But Margaret was seated 4 feet away at the head of Lady Forsyth's table, and when the woman finished speaking, the Dowager Duchess of Ashford set down her wine-glass, turned in her chair with the unhurried composure of someone entirely at ease, and said, in a voice that carried considerably further than the woman's had, "I believe you have already met my solicitor, Mr. Harcourt. He will be available tomorrow morning, should you wish to continue this conversation in a more appropriate setting." The room did not recover its previous noise for a very long time. She left London within the fortnight. There was no dramatic departure, no scene at the station, no final letter, no last attempt at contact. She simply ceased to be present, the way a rumor ceases to be interesting once the truth has replaced it. Her former brother-in-law's arrangement with the solicitors was quietly dissolved under circumstances that Harcourt described with characteristic understatement as mutually discouraging. The locked rosewood box was eventually returned to the Ashford family's lawyers, its contents confirming everything that had already been documented and adding several details that clarified the full scope of what had been planned. What she had lost was considerable. Not simply the Duke, and not simply the house, and not simply the settlement that would have secured her future across multiple generations. What she had lost was the assumption that had underpinned the entire plan from its beginning. The assumption that the most dangerous person in any aristocratic household was the one with the title. She had studied the Duke of Ashford with great care. She had identified his grief, his isolation, his capacity for loyalty, and she had constructed an approach designed to work precisely on those qualities. She had researched the family's legal position, their financial arrangements, their social connections. She had been, in her own way, extraordinarily thorough. But she had not once considered the woman who arrived at the servants' entrance with a basket of linens. She had looked at an apron and seen a laundress. She had not looked again. And that single failure of observation, that one moment of ordinary, unconsidered condescension, had cost her everything. It was not the Duke's intelligence that had undone her. It was not the solicitor's diligence, nor the under-butler's quiet loyalty, nor the weight of legal documentation assembled against her. It was a mother who loved her son without announcement, who acted without applause, and who had understood, from the first moment she heard that voice through a 3-inch gap in a drawing-room door, exactly what was at stake. The Duke of Ashford did not speak publicly about what had occurred. He was not the kind of man who offered explanations to society, and society, sensing this, did not press him. What was noticed, gradually, and then with increasing interest, was the change in him, not a dramatic change, not the kind that announces itself, a quieter one. He began visiting his northern estates more regularly, which meant more time with his son. He was seen on 2 occasions walking in the park with the boy on his shoulders, both of them apparently engaged in a serious discussion about the relative merits of various cloud formations. He declined 3 invitations to events that would previously have been obligatory. He accepted 2 that he would previously have avoided. He wrote, his secretary mentioned to no one in particular, considerably more letters to his mother than he had in recent years. Margaret herself said very little about the events of that autumn, even to her closest friends. She did not claim credit, did not accept the particular form of social admiration that comes with having been visibly right about something important. When Lady Forsyth, who had been present at the dinner and had dined out on the story for weeks, asked her directly how she had known, Margaret considered the question for a moment and then answered it simply. She said that she had not known anything at first. She had only heard something that didn't sound right and had decided to listen more carefully before speaking. That was all. Sometimes, she added, the most useful thing a person can do is to be completely underestimated. The boy, Edward, 6 years old, heir to the Ashford dukedom, came to stay with his grandmother for a fortnight that December. On his last evening he asked her why the laundry basket in the front hall was so much nicer than the ones the maids used. She told him it was a very old basket, and that it had once been on an important errand, and that she kept it as a reminder. He accepted this with the gravity of a child who understands that adults keep objects for reasons that will only make sense later. He kissed her good night and went upstairs. Margaret set her hand on the wicker handle for a moment in the lamplight and allowed herself, quietly and entirely alone, the smallest possible smile. It had been, all things considered, a very good errand.